I have a 6-year-old grandson. He says, "Grandpa, how are you going to win the election?" I said, "You get more votes than the other person. It's as simple as that."
It's quite not that simple. You got to give or take about 3 million votes. That's how you win. Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It's Thursday, November 1st. Joe is off this morning, but along with Willie and me, we have MSNBC contributor Mike Barnicle, Republican strategist and MSNBC political analyst Susan Del Percio is with us. Editor of Commentary Magazine, contributing editor of the Weekly Standard, and columnist at the New York Post, John Podhoretz, and co-founder and CEO of Axios, Jim VandeHei is with us. A lot to talk about now. 5 days from the midterm elections, President Trump is doing everything he can to define the debate. Yesterday, he tripled the estimated number of U.S. troops that he wants to go to the U.S.-Mexico border to the number of 15,000, more than the number of troops serving in Afghanistan. It's a detail that ABC News pressed him on last night.
You're talking about 10,000, maybe 15,000 active duty U.S. military to the border, more than we have fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan, more than we have fighting ISIS in Syria. You're really going to do that?
It's very important. We have to have a wall of people, very highly trained people, terrific, dedicated patriots. That's what they are. You have caravans coming up that look a lot larger than it's reported, actually. I mean, I'm pretty good at estimating crowd size, and I will tell you, they look a lot bigger than people would think.
Despite holding more than 60 votes to repeal the Affordable Care Act, including one followed by a celebration in the White House Rose Garden last year, the president continues to make claims like this tweet, quote, "Republicans will protect people with pre-existing conditions far better than the Dems." A complete lie. In Illinois, former Vice President Joe Biden responded.
You have the President of the United States saying, "We guarantee," or whatever his phrase was, "everybody's covered with pre-existing conditions is covered." Simply not true. They're either not telling the truth or they're really stupid.
At the president's campaign rally in Florida last night, which burst into a chant of "lock him up" about Tallahassee Mayor Andrew Gillum, the leading Democratic candidate for governor, the president reduced birthright citizenship, which experts consider an explicit passage of the Constitution, to, quote, "a crazy policy," and falsely argued that Democrats support no border enforcement.
A vote for Democrats is a vote to liquidate America's borders, and it's a vote to let meth, fentanyl, heroin, and other deadly drugs pour across our borders.
And there was also this promise from the president 12 days ago.
We are going to be putting in and are studying very deeply right now, round the clock, a major tax cut for middle-income people.
What was your time frame for that?
I would say sometime around the 1st of November, maybe a little before that.
Reminder, today is November 1st. Nothing. Finally, the president made this argument for his party next week.
If the midterms, for some reason, don't do so well for Republicans, I think you're all going to lose a lot of money. I hate to say that. I think you're going to lose a lot of money.
So Willie Geist, he's flailing all over the place, whether it's racist-based policies. I'll put quotes around that because a lot of what he's saying, which has racist tones to it, isn't even possible. And I don't even know where to begin in terms of describing a president who wants to put 15,000 troops, the size of the troops in Afghanistan or less, to a border to receive a caravan of men, women, children, babies that is not even close to the border at this point.
Well, he wants to put America on a war footing at the southern border. That's what 15,000 troops is. That's a war footing. There are 14,000 troops, as you pointed out, in Afghanistan, give or take. So about the same number, same deployment is what he's looking for there. But as you say, words are cheap. The tax cut was out there a week ago. Where's the tax cut? We're a few days now from Election Day. He said there's going to be a middle-class tax cut before Election Day to get people out to the polls. There's no tax cut. And Mike Barnicle, when he talks about the border, talks about ending birthright citizenship. These, again, are things to be done with 5 days left till Election Day, things to float into the atmosphere, things to rev people up. I hope that he's not going to send 15,000 troops to the border and put them down there for a caravan that may arrive with a few hundred people in 2 months.
Well, if anyone would know that this is a scam being perpetrated by the president, based upon the fact that there's a dwindling group of truly desperate people still hundreds of miles away from the border, en route to the border. If anyone would know that it's a scam as well as a horrible and expensive misuse of the military, it would be Secretary of Defense Mattis. And I would hope that we could get him on the record about the use of these troops at the border. And John, I don't know about you, but the President of the United States in my lifetime, which is considerable, it's longer than yours, I've never seen, I'm telling you, I go back to the '68 campaign, I've never seen the use of fear and division being employed by a national leader, and that's what he is by virtue of the fact that he's the President of the United States, being used on a daily, sometimes hourly basis. I've never seen it.
What I'm struck by is how self-conscious it is. In other words, if you're going to exploit fear and division, you generally don't read the stage directions. It's like when he said in that interview with ABC, I'm really good at counting crowds. So that's like that's a nihilistic joke about the crowd counting issue at the inauguration. Right. He's turning this into it was like a comedian's bit. It's like, I'm really good at counting crowds, so I know we need 15,000 troops because I can see there's a lot more people in that caravan. If you look at that and you think about what this is, it's like he's going, hey, I'm stoking fear. Look over here at me, I'm stoking fear, which doesn't, I think, really stoke fear. That's the interesting thing. When you do it that way, there's something totally false about it.
Yeah, and
I mean, these 15,000 troops, they could literally, you could make the entirely opposite argument, which is you're saying, and they'll all escort, each individually will take one of the caravan members by hand and escort them across the border like a welcoming committee.
And Susan, I would submit that fear extends into vast numbers of people in the Republican Party, vast numbers of candidates who are so afraid to stand up and say, hey, wait a minute.
Yeah, and it's amazing. Think about a leader of a country that uses military force and debases the media in order to increase his political strength. You would say that could not happen in the United States of America. And right now, there are a lot of Republicans out there who should be standing up. If you're in a swing district right now, I suggest doing an ad straight to camera and say, this fear, this happening is unacceptable, and I will stand up against it, because that may help you win if you're in a swing district. Buying into this will only hurt you, and you're going to lose because the turnout in swing districts and the congressional races are going to go against you.
So let's take a look at how this is playing with the public. A new NPR PBS NewsHour Marist poll measures the national mood of registered voters conducted Sunday through Monday in the wake of a spree of political violence, measuring the national mood heading into the final week of the campaign. In the poll, President Trump's job rating among registered voters stands at 41%. 52% disapprove. Asked about the tone in politics since Trump was elected, 75% say it's gotten worse, 16% believe it stayed the same, and 7% say it improved. Given choices on whom they blame for the lack of civility in politics, 42% say the president, 28% say the media, 18% said Democrats in Congress, and 7% said congressional Republicans. And on whether they fear the tone in politics will lead to violence, about 8 in 10 voters say they are very concerned or concerned. 21% are not very or at all concerned. So Jim Vandehei, Axios out with an exclusive clip of President Trump discussing his rhetoric toward the press. Let's listen, and we'll talk to you on the other side of it.
To be honest, what scares the crap out of me is that if you're saying enemy the people, God forbid,
have to fight back. You're right.
No, but hold on a second. But this thing, God forbid that somebody, you've got fervent supporters. They love you. They listen to you. Enemy the people. Enemy the people.
They like me more because of that.
They like you more. But what happens if all of a sudden someone gets shot? Someone shoots one of these reporters?
Jim,
I don't think you think we're the enemy of the people.
I don't. But if you gave me false reports, I would say that's not a good thing for our country.
But don't you worry at all? I mean, people, you are like the most powerful man in the world, and if you say that word, enemy, literally tens of thousands of people go into a stadium to listen to you, and then people go on social media and they get themselves so jazzed up. There's got to be a part of you that's like, damn it, I'm scared that someone is going to take it too
It's
far.
my only form of fighting back. I couldn't be here if I did that.
You won.
You
have the presidency.
No, but I did this before I won.
So, Jim, it's about the fight. Well, that was a fascinating exchange with President Trump there. What did you take away from it?
You know what's most fascinating is that throughout the interview, that was where he seemed most comfortable. He wanted that confrontation. He so believes that he is aggrieved, that he is like the victim of a media that's more powerful than him. And then he also concedes that I feel aggrieved, but I also feel like my base demands it. Even if I didn't want to attack you, even if I didn't want to turn up the boil, that I have to. And I even asked him at one point, I was like, every other president, when there's a terrorist attack or something, they try to turn down the boil. And it seems like you have an obligation to turn it up. And he doesn't say no. He basically says yes. Yeah. He keeps saying, I have no choice. But he has a million choices, and he keeps choosing escalation. And I do worry profoundly that something bad will happen as a result of this. I disagree with what John was saying earlier, that people get the joke and maybe they know this is just fear-mongering. I don't think so. I think there's people at full boil, and we're playing with fire.
Jim Vanda, I completely agree with you, and I will tell you that what you saw and how you are articulating it reflects what we saw during the campaign when we knew Donald Trump and actually spoke with him and went in to his office and talked about the dangers of his birtherism. And he looked at Joe as if Joe would be in on the joke, and he wasn't, and said, but you know, it really works. You know, it really works. I got to do it. It works. And we said, no. You don't got to do it because this is wrong. And we said it on the air, but we also said it to his face. But here's the problem. You say he's most comfortable in that pocket? He is. You know why? Because he has no command of the facts, no commands of a sense of what a policy is, no command or understanding of what the Constitution is about. He basically admitted to us that he doesn't read. He can't read. He takes things in mostly through hearing it, through watching it, through listening to it, being a part of it. He has a command of playing the media. That's his sweet spot. You're absolutely right. That is exactly where he's comfortable because he can use evil ways of manipulating people's thoughts, their beliefs, and tapping into racism with his command of the media.
There's no doubt that it was actually a very frustrating interview until that point, because when you talk to him about policy, it was just, he's sort of all over the place. We were talking to him at one point about Google and Amazon and Facebook. At one point he said, I'm going to break them up, and the next point I'm going to protect them. And it's just, he's all over. But when he gets there, it's clear what he wanted to talk about on that day. Of all the things that were happening in the world, he wanted to talk about his obsession with the media, with very specific media figures, where he is comfortable. And that's why there's not going to be a point, even if things get worse. We've already had a shooting. We've already had these bombs that were sent via mail. So even if things get worse, it was clear he'll never feel like he has an obligation to tone it down. And that's dangerous because even at the worst, even people who dislike George Bush, like when things were bad, when things were at a full boil, he knew he had the obligation to bring the boil down. He understands human impulse. He understands the danger when you have dry kindling and hot tempers, that those two can spark something much worse than what we've seen. And that is the thing I would say to Trump supporters. This stuff does matter. The words do matter. And if, God forbid, people take that enemy, 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 what do you think people think when they say enemy? They think, oh my God, like this isn't just my political opponent. It's someone who, you know what, maybe they got to be hit. Maybe they got to be shot. And that is the danger at the point that we're sitting at. And you know what? It's going to get worse. After the election, we're not going to be talking about caravans. We're going to be talking about the Republican establishment and Robert Mueller and the media again. And it's going to be in very, very similar terms.
And he would hate for the Democrats to have power in light of all of that. But I will just say it's not just dangerous. It's already happened. Okay, we're in a place right now where the president is deflecting from two major national events, one an attack on our democracy, the other a slaughter at a synagogue, the worst in U.S. history. The president pushes lies. He pushed birtherism so comfortably before the campaign, before he was even president. He pushes lies with ease because he can control them, because he can make the words up as he goes along. And that gives him a sense of comfort. He doesn't need to know anything. He just knows he can push a lie and try and speak extemporaneously in a dramatic way and push things that tap into people.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.